I think if you ask most people, the restraint on the essay is you have to tell the truth. You cannot lie. Or if you lie, you can only do so unintentionally or unwittingly. You are not allowed to do so with purpose, unless you foreground in the essay that that's what you're doing, and you're doing it for a reason. Some people don't agree with that. We've been using a collection of essays this semester, John D'Agata's The Next American Essay, in which a couple of the pieces were published as fiction. Two of those in particular are Jamaica Kincaid's Girl, which is a monologue from a woman in a Caribbean culture who's supposedly talking to this young girl about how she should act. And the other of those is The Intercession of the Saints by Carol Meso, which is sort of a lost chapter of her novel Ava. Both of these were published as fiction, but I would make the argument that Meso's is exclusively fiction and doesn't belong in an essay collection, precisely because it's dealing with characters who were completely invented, two of them, about dialogues that never took place, about scenes that never occurred except in the author's mind. So even though there are moments of meditation on the saints and their value and the act of intercession itself, and on a number of other things that we would associate with real-world daily events, it's still housed in the architecture of a story and not an essay. I would make a counter-argument on Jamaica Kincaid's story only because it seems to suggest a model of life common to a lot of different girls in that culture. The character is never named. The character is never really particularly situated. So it's almost as if the narrator of this story is providing guidelines for the way a life in that culture needs to be lived. And once you get into that, you're in a kind of cultural critique mode, and that's very strongly within the essay's purview. So I would say, even though that uses a dramatic situation and even an implied narrative to make its point, that it's still dancing on that line between fiction and nonfiction, where to me The Intercession of the Saints has tipped firmly into fiction. I will say that there are ways to bring fiction into the essay if you want. One of my favorite examples is Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior, where you have a writer, Kingston, trying to reconstruct a past that no one's willing to talk about. She's trying to figure out what happened to her ancestors in China in this book, The Woman Warrior. And in one of the more famous chapters of that book that often gets excerpted as No Name Woman, she actually creates an ancestry for herself, using whatever bits and snatches of dialogue or overheard conversations or conjecture that she can make based on what she knows about her family. But she's very clear that that's what she's doing. She says, I don't have this past. She says, people won't talk about it. But in order for me to make sense of my life, this is the narrative that I tell myself. And that's a very compelling moment. I mean, what do we do when the past is absent? How do we replace it? And so it's really more about the process of her doing that. And the story is extremely moving. She invents this female ancestor who has an affair and is then persecuted, the entire family, by villagers because she gets pregnant, and so she ultimately drowns herself and her child in a well. And it seems plausible. I mean, it's a very well-crafted story. Does that plausibility have anything to do with the non-fiction-ness of the piece? I don't know. I mean, it's a good story, well told, so it's convincing. But whatever the relationship of that story to reality, I think what sets this apart as nonfiction is Kingston's willingness to say up front, I'm making this up. And once she does that, she's allowed by readers to go wherever she wants.